So we're going to talk about the conflict in Asia and in Japan in regards to post-World War II. And that's going to focus on also China and Korea and Egypt in Africa. We're going to talk about Dwight Eisenhower. We're going to cover as much of this as we can without getting too deep into it. But, you definitely want to make sure that we understand that the Cold War is really escalating everywhere throughout the world. The Cold War affected our interactions all over the globe with countries on every continent, for sure. So the first kind of idea that this is going to start to happen, this Cold War is going to affect Asia, is when the U.S. basically takes over Japan and all Japanese possessions in the Pacific Ocean. And you can kind of rule this to the whole idea of like the victor goes the spoils, right? Japan talked a lot of crap. We really didn't want to listen to them anymore, so we bombed them, and then they surrendered, and then we get all their stuff, which kind of worked out well for us in the long run, surprisingly, because usually that didn't work out very well for a country. But now us and Japan, we real tight, you know what I mean? We like besties. And so basically the reason we did this, though, was because we didn't want Japan to think that they could go about trying to reconquer the Pacific and all this and then kind of kick back up these conflicts. And so the U.S. is actually going to occupy Japan completely with their military until 1952. And at that point, we basically trust them enough to be like, oh, y'all realize how great democracy is and how good capitalism is. And we essentially give them back autonomous rule. And like I said, that kind of really builds into a pretty good relationship that we have with Japan. They're one of our closest allies in Asia. In fact, if something ever pops off with China, which seems like it's possible, unfortunately, it's very likely that North Korea would probably get involved with that, which means that crazy dude would try and launch nukes on everybody because he's insane. But we do turn it back over to Japan, and they actually, because we really did help them, they allow us to keep all of our naval bases there in the Pacific undisturbed. And that really does kind of allow us to police that region for the next, 50, 60, 70 years. We kind of we use that as a base of operations, particularly when we start the Korea War, not start it, but when we join the Korea War, when we join the Vietnam conflict. I can't really call it a war because we don't ever declare war in Vietnam. But it really allows us to kind of have a good relationship with a country there. The next major event that's going to really put a strain on the relationships in Asia is going to be the Communist Revolution in China, which takes place over a period of several years. It also culminates in Chiang Kai-shek, the guy who's on the left, being removed from power. He was in charge of China. He gets removed from power and has to flee to Taiwan. And then this guy, Mao Zedong, on the right, becomes the leader of the Communist Party in China. He's probably one of the most controversial figures, frankly, in all of human history. You have, the Tiananmen Square event, and basically it's at that event where you have the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and Mao Zedong basically, embraces communism, and he also has this idea that, he wants to catch China up to the rest of the world by really, moving China forward. And they'd been, occupied by Japan, and now they weren't. And so Mao is going to institute these very sweeping land reforms that, he goes, hey, we got to turn all of this land into agricultural land so we can take care of ourselves. And through taking care of ourselves, we'll be able to catch up with the rest of the world. And so we need all this land for agriculture. And so he's going to take all these people's land, and there's no more private property. Everything belongs to the government now. And so if you have a problem with that, well, we'll just kill you and your entire family, and now nobody owns the land. So the government can just take it. And so basically he, has these very powerful, communist initiatives that cause a lot of damage and kill millions and millions and millions and millions of Chinese people. I mean, unbelievable millions of Chinese people. Starves them to death, rounds them up, puts them in prison. It's kind of crazy. It's pretty... The number ranges, the estimates for the number of people that Mao Zedong is responsible for killing through his communist reforms is anywhere between, 20 and 55 million. Yeah. So just, remember the Japanese and the Asian Holocaust kill about, 6 million Chinese. And then they end World War II and all the Chinese people are like, finally, the Japanese are gone. And Mao Zedong goes, oh yeah, just kidding, 50 million more. So, yay, communism, freaking buttholes. Under Chairman Mao, you have the creation of the People's Republic of China. Harry Truman refused to recognize Communist China and instead works on building up Japan. And so, obviously the Chinese are going to place the blame on Truman for these hard times that the people are going to have, right? Like, they're going to be like, oh, everything's bad, but it's only because America won't recognize us as a country. And so basically, the communist government does a very good job of, portraying Western powers, particularly the United States, as the enemy very early on. And that kind of creates a super ultra nationalism that continues even to today. But like we said, they kind of start this idea called the Great Leap Forward, where we're going to catch up to everybody, and we're going to do that by killing 50 million people. So, yay, China, a bunch of jerks. Then that brings us to Korea and the Korean War, which was fought from 1950 to 1953. It was really the starting point. The starting point was really like that we wanted to contain communism. So what we're really worried about is now that China is communist, they're going to China's going to try and expand communism because they need even more resources. And so they want to expand communism, and they begin to do this into Korea. And, in Europe, we'd been trying to use the Marshall Plan where we put all that money into the countries and say, no, look how great democracy is and how great capitalism is. And that had been very successful in containing communism there against Soviet communism. But Chinese communism was a little bit different. And so we look at, China and the Soviet Union. We say we've got to keep them where they're at. And so basically, the Soviet Union at the end of World War II is going to send troops into Korea and occupy Korea. And they're going to send troops to help China occupy the northern section of Korea. Well, when they do that, the United States says, well, we're not going to let you take the whole Korean peninsula. That gets you really close to Japan. And we're trying to do something here with Japan. We don't want you that close to them. So they, along with the United Nations, send troops to occupy the southern part of Korea. And you end up with this division line here, where it's like the 38th parallel or 38th parallel. And so at this line, you have Soviet, communist, Chinese-backed communism here. And then we have U.S. and United Nations-backed democracy down here. So you end up with a democratic South Korea. And then in the north, you have the Republic of Korea, communist North Korea. And so you have this tension, right? Well, June 25th of 1950, the North Koreans are going to invade South Korea. And they're kind of driven by these communist pressures from the Soviets to try and expand, to try and make a unified communist nation. But obviously the U.S. is not going to allow that to happen. Now, they know the Soviets are behind it, so they can't just attack the Soviets. So this becomes a really good opportunity to show the Soviets, hey, if you're going to try and expand communism militarily, we can play that game too. We'll support the South Koreans. And so on September of 1950, we land outside of Seoul, and we land troops with Douglas MacArthur, and he's able to successfully drive back the North Korean fighters. But once they kind of drive them back, it looks like we're about to win the whole thing. And so MacArthur comes out and he says, hey, I think we can end this right now. All we have to do is be willing to go ahead and push all of these guys out. Well, the U.S. looks at it and they go, well, you've got the Chinese, and we don't want to start a fight with the Chinese. And if we start a fight with the Chinese, they're aligned with the Soviets. And if we truly get directly involved with the Chinese, then we're going to be in trouble. So we kind of stop. Truman kind of becomes a sissy a little bit. And he decides, no. We're not going to do that. We're going to basically hold up. Let's just see what happens. We've basically got the communist whipped. North Korea was almost not even ever a thing. Like, everything we know about Kim Jong-un and all them crazy Kim Jong crazies almost never happened if Truman had not been so worried about picking a fight with the Chinese. And so when we paused to kind of be like, let's just see what happens. So September 1950, we basically drive the communists out of Korea. We get all the way up. If you're looking at this map, we basically advance all the way to like here. We basically have control. Well, we just stop. And then by October and November, 300,000 Chinese soldiers cross the Yalu River to aid North Korea, armed with Soviet weaponry. And now we get taken off guard and essentially get driven back. And now as we said, the American troops are kind of stuck. They push and push and push. It draws China into the war, right? They push them back to the south, and the war ends in a stalemate, essentially. We almost ended North Korea as a thing. What? Oh. We almost drive them out. We don't want to start a fight with China because we worry the Soviets will get involved. Then the Soviets arm the Chinese, and they join the fight anyways, drive us back, and it essentially ends in a complete stalemate, and we're not able to win anything. So what we end up with is the North and South Korea divided at that line, basically the exact same line that was drawn before the war, and the North becomes an incredibly terrible place. It's like one of the worst places to live in the world because of their style of communism. The result of this basically means that America is going to greatly rearm themselves and build up for war. But you can see here, we drive them all the way to here. I mean, look at this. Look at this line. That's all that was left of communist North Korea. And we were like, Truman was like, well, just hold on. You're getting really close to China. They're going to get upset. And the Chinese got upset anyways. And so, as I said, MacArthur comes out and says, hey, there's no substitute for victory. MacArthur said that, we could end all of this now. In fact, we could probably take China back if we did this smart. I mean, we've got nuclear bombs. We could just bomb them. I mean, MacArthur wanted to drop more nukes, which is probably would have been a bad thing for sure. But, it basically, Truman ends up removing MacArthur from command in 1951. That just becomes a big thing. And he promotes a guy named Omar Bradley, who's famous for saying that, for saying attacking China directly would be the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. So basically, he understood that if you just go after China, you're really doing it to get back at the Soviets. You're not really going to change all that much. You're really just going to cause chaos. It's not the right time to do that. Take the idea that you've created a buffer state with South Korea. Don't go and attack China. You're going to kill millions of people that are not involved in this because you really want to fight the Soviets. The Soviets are going to give all the weapons and everything they can. It's just going to be a terrible situation. And then if somebody launches a nuke, we're done. Everybody's done. So this is not the right time to try and pick a fight with the Soviet Union by choosing China. But at the same time, I mean, Can you imagine a world where there was no communist China or communist North Korea? Vietnam wouldn't have happened. All of those things. Well, Vietnam would have probably still happened, but it would have been very different because the people of Vietnam still didn't want the French to be in charge of them, but it probably wouldn't have been, the Soviets and the Chinese versus America in that. As far as an outcome for the Korean War, almost 34,000 U.S. soldiers die in combat, plus 11,000 non-combat deaths and missing in actions. That is very significant. But we killed about 4 million Asian combatants. So yeah, we lost like 50,000. But this tells you all you need to understand. Guys, we lost 50,000. They lost 4 million between North and South Korea and the Chinese. 4 million. Some of those people were on our side, obviously. But we are the ones that quit. You want to know why? Because they were like, we don't care. We killed 50 million of our own people. We don't care if you kill 50 million more. Good, more food for us. They did not care. And we realized if we'd have gone to war with China, we'd have had to kill everybody. And that's not worth it. You get what I'm saying? Now, again, it might have been worth it to all those people that end up starving to death over the next 70 years in China. But it wasn't worth it at the time because we would have just had to kill everybody. It would have been brutal. It would have been terrible. So unfortunately, the Korean War basically ends with a stalemate, and we still have North and South Korea. So back to the U.S., there's a new wave of elections still in the early 50s. Truman could have run again, even though he'd served 2 terms, or he'd served a term and a half. Remember, he had served essentially, this 22nd Amendment said that presidents can only serve 2 terms, right? But we know that, so he had served when FDR died, and then he got elected once. So he'd been in president for like 6-7 years. He could have, because he had not served a full term or more than half of a term, he could have run for a second full term, okay? But he doesn't, he wants nothing to do with it at all. He's like, I'm done with this. Like, we ended World War II. I'm going to get the blame for the atomic bomb. We had the Korean War. This was a mess. This Cold War thing is going very poorly. Like, I'm out of here. I don't want to be part of this anymore. So the Democrats are going to run a guy named Stevenson, and the Republicans are going to run a guy, so Adlai Stevenson, and then Republicans are going to run this guy, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so Eisenhower, he was a very, popular general in World War II. He basically led all the Allied forces in Europe, helped defeat the Nazis, liberated France. Everybody's like, yay. And so he runs on a great slogan, which is be like Ike. And so, yeah, I know. Michael Jordan didn't invent that. And so, again, he was very, very famous. He absolutely dominates Adlai Stevenson. 442 electoral votes to 89. Look at the popular vote, 6.5 million more votes, which is crazy. One of the biggest landslides in American history. Now, understand, the South still votes Democrat down here, and there was, what is this, 61 million votes cast, and that's without any black people in the South voting. It's the 50s. So if black people in the South had been allowed to vote, they would have voted Republican. And had they voted Republican, he probably would have won by 20 million votes. I mean, it's unbelievable. FDR had a few victories bigger than that, but Eisenhower's is very, very, very impressive. He was very famous for his moderate, stance. It was kind of a breath of fresh air, that he was determined to get both parties kind of together. And, there was a guy named Lyndon Baines Johnson. he was the leader of the Democrat Party, and he's kind of, Eisenhower's actually going to bring him over to the White House and sit down with him because he was Speaker of the House, and try and work and say, hey, we got to be bipartisan. We're all one America. We're going to come together. Eisenhower, I think, is widely regarded, I don't know, I feel like he is as one of the greatest presidents of all time. I mean, he really is one of the greats. He just was a likable person who worked with both sides of the aisle. And was a great leader, just in general, a great leader. I mean, obviously a general, but and so everybody kind of saw him as a father figure, they're like a grandpa, and it reflected because he was reelected in 1956 as well. But again, Eisenhower, he does a lot of good things, and after he is out, the Cold War tensions really pick up. So the Soviets didn't really mess with America during his time as president because they knew Eisenhower wasn't going to put up with that noise. You know what I mean? He won World War II, so, kind of a beast. Now, we also know that internationally he pushes for peace. He went to the UN and he calls for the UN to promote peaceful uses of atomic energy. He wants to have the world invest in atomic reactors and stuff like that. And he says, hey, we've got this technology. We know how to use it. It can be beneficial to all mankind. It doesn't just have to be used for weapons. And so he is kind of celebrated for trying to be peaceful and promoting peace from a place of strength, though. I mean, it's just us and the Soviets that have all these bombs. The whole time he's saying, oh, yeah, we should be peaceful. He's like, hey, we should make a lot of atomic bombs. So he understood negotiating from a place of strength is very important, but he didn't want another war. He also does a pretty good job with another crisis, which was in Egypt, and this is known as the Suez Canal crisis. Background here is this is just another region where the Americans are kind of policing it. The Soviets are trying to build influence, and you actually have the Russians having quite a bit of influence in Syria and some of those places in the Middle East. But Eisenhower announces something called the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1967. Basically says that any country, or 1957, my bad, that any country could request American economic assistance for military aid, and if they felt threatened by another country. Basically, he meant, if you are worried the Russians are going to show up and try and strong-arm you, just ask us for help and we'll send tanks. Again, negotiating from a place of strength. Well, obviously, that's not going to go over well with Russia. And so you have this crisis where France and England and Israel are kind of attacked. They attack, and Russia threatens to send troops, and it's all based on this idea that Gamal Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal was essential to get goods from Europe and the Mediterranean Sea into the Indian Ocean. Basically, you could go through the Red Sea and then out into the Black Sea and into Asia, instead of having to go all the way around Africa. So they had built the Suez Canal so that you didn't have to sail around Africa. And Egypt basically says, it's ours now. And so everybody's like, you can't do that. We helped you build it. Like, that's our money. You can't just take that. This is a world problem, right? And so the Soviets stand behind Nasser, and everybody else kind of stands up and says, you can't do that. And Eisenhower is able to kind of wade through and negotiate a solution there that doesn't result in war, because that was just our next opportunity to really get into a next world war. If that had gone to actual armed conflict, we would have been in really big trouble. So he's able to, not only is he a good general, not only is he likable, but he's a good diplomat as well. So it just kind of speaks again to his credit. The last point that we've kind of talked about, both the USSR and the U.S. have nuclear bombs at this point. They've actually agreed to a treaty that banned testing these in the atmosphere because we realized, radiation, bad. And so in 1957, the Russians launched their first satellite, Sputnik, and they launch it, and now it's basically a spy satellite that you can't shoot down because it's in space. And this really freaks us out because at any point in time, the Russians can use this satellite to take pictures of the United States, and there's nothing we can do about it. And it scares us, and we realize the next frontier of warfare is probably going to be in space. That's where it's really going to happen. And not like actual warfare, but that's where information and all that stuff's going to happen. And so, July of 1958, you have the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and you end up with a space race. And we're going to talk about that as we kind of get through the next module or so. But it was just another leg of the Cold War, where we don't want the Russians to have any advantage in space that we don't have. We got to go, match them satellite for satellite. And then, obviously, that's going to end up leading into getting onto the moon, which is insane that we did that, in all honesty. And we did. But it's kind of crazy to think that we actually got to the moon. When we did, at least. Never made it back, but because it's very expensive. But we did. And so that, like I said, that was just kind of another section to kind of talk about the Cold War there.